Now, as you probably know, emergency rule in Rivers State is now well and truly entrenched after both houses in the National Assembly set aside any objections and gave it their official imprimatur. The process went ahead despite the deluge of protests from ordinary Nigerians, some lawmakers and governors, a crop of this country's respected constitutional lawyers, the Nigerian Bar Association, and hundreds of civil society groups. Nigeria's Attorney General and Minister for Justice defended the imposition, insisting that the actions of the suspended governor, Fubara, left President Tinubu with no other options. He said the governor had enabled militants in the Niger Delta to attack oil installations, and he suggested that the suspension of the governor was only temporary and had actually saved him from imminent impeachment. But this hasn't stopped members of the opposition from calling it a political grab for power in a crucial swing state, accusing the government of using the crisis to sideline political opponents, an accusation the government denies. Well, for his reaction to all this, I'm joined now in the studio by the National Publicity Secretary of the ruling APC party, Barrister Felix Morka. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Charles.
Thank you very much indeed. You don't look like a guy who's living in the oven. I mean, you look perfectly well manicured, as always.
Thank you.
I wonder what goes through your mind, though, when you hear the deluge of protests from so many across Nigeria who see the imposition of emergency rule in Rivers State, as well as the method by which it was approved by the National Assembly, as unconstitutional.
First of all, Charles, thank you for having me. First, I listened to your intro.
Yes, I noticed you were scribbling furiously while you were listening to it. So I figured you were going to talk about it.
That's right. First, our democracy is not crumbling. It's nothing crumbling but our democracy. Second...
That's from your perspective.
Always.
Because you're in the ruling party.
You're asking me, yes. That's why I'm here, to share my perspectives, right?
Okay.
Secondly, there is no constitutional crisis in Nigeria today. There was a constitutional crisis in Rivers State up until the declaration of the state of emergency. And that constitutional crisis was initiated, authored, and precipitated by the governor of Rivers State, Governor Fubara. Now, I've listened very carefully to a lot of analysts and speakers who have come through, your program and other programs, quite frankly, around our television space. And I think that, yes, some of them are well-intentioned, but the problem is that they simply choose to gloss over the critical, factual, predicate of this crisis. Because if you get that wrong, then forever you will reach a wrong, conclusion or understanding of what is playing out. What happened in Rivers State? A governor was elected. Shortly after his election, this governor, Governor Fubara, sought to take control, basically, by replacing the Speaker of the Rivers House of Assembly. Some governors do that because they want to be more comfortable with, people that they prefer who are in charge. Now, unfortunately, these members of the Rivers House of Assembly stood their ground. That, look, you know what? Listen, we're here, we're elected by our people to represent them. We stand our ground. When that failed, when that effort to replace the Speaker failed, this governor made a backflip and decided to dismantle the legislature. Shortly after that, he proceeded to destroy the House of Assembly complex. Now, let me just, take a breath here.
Yeah, because that's not quite how it happened.
Yeah, that's right. Because if you don't get this point, anything else you think or say is misplaced. It's like putting something on nothing and expect it to stand. You can only stand on your emotions and speak from the abundance of your emotions, but you will be speaking from the facts. Now, we're talking about Rivers State, and the question you've asked me is about the declaration of emergency rule. But the real question we should be talking about is whether or not, from the day Governor Fubara destroyed the House of Assembly, whether there was in fact a government, constitutionally speaking, in that state. And my position is that there was no government in Rivers State from the day that this governor made a cautious decision to demolish a branch of government. Governor Fubara destroyed and utterly abolished the legislature from that day. And Charles, you are one of Nigeria's leading professional, media, people. What is the democracy with a governor without a legislature? You see, now I would have actually come here today and I'll be very calm, as I am always, if those who are today spewing a lot of, power from their words, if they had expressed just a quarter of outrage at the time that Governor Fubara destroyed the Rivers House of Assembly, if they had only just, issued some condemnation and said, look, Governor, this is actually a bit, extreme. They didn't do that. Everybody was quiet. And today, they have found their voices to speak to the declaration by the president of a state of emergency in Rivers State. Now, that is intellectually dishonest on the part of a lot of those who speak today, and which is why I don't take them very seriously. Now, let me just, take that a little further. After the governor did that, he not only demolished the assembly, he locked them out. He froze them in a package and cast them aside as though they didn't exist, as though our constitution never intended to provide for a legislative body in Rivers State. He completely froze the allowances, he froze the allocation, he froze every penny flowing to the assembly. And then, not only that, Governor Fubara slapped democracy in the face by, anointing 2-3 people to be his legislature in preference to a democratically elected institution of, the House of Assembly in Rivers State. And then proceeded to govern, and govern unconstitutionally, and govern illegally, and govern unlawfully in Rivers State. Now, for more than nearly 14 months, that was going on. These people who are busy bouncing around and throwing words around, empty words for that matter, were silent. They were completely, muffled. They were silent. They spoke nothing, Charles, about this situation I'm describing. Because, see, look, I'm a constitutional lawyer, and when I see a wrong, I will admit it. And
you don't see a wrong here.
No. We're not there yet, Charles. We're not on that point yet. I'm building up to that point, and I will answer that question.
You can't take the entire.
I can't. I'm not taking that time. But
so let me
since you're taking background straight.
Yeah, but since you're taking it in bits, let me take it in bits as well.
Yes.
You talked about the fact that the governor destroyed the building, the State Assembly building, and kind of moved the people off, and you portrayed it as though this was something he set out to do as a way of trying to gain leverage over the State Assembly. But you do forget that there was an attack on that building. There was a bombing attack on that building, which kind of rendered it almost unusable. And the governor then proceeded to destroy the building, bring it down, demolish it, with a plan of rebuilding it, which he said at the time. What evidence is there linking the governor, Fubara, to the attack on the State House of Assembly? He demolished the Assembly building because it had been bombed by hoodlums a couple of months before he ordered the demolition.
Okay, Charles. In our constitutional democracy, a governor bears responsibility for things that happen in his state. Now, you said the building was bombed by hoodlums. Charles, have you reported on Arise Television what was done by way of investigation by this governor about the attack you discuss of the State House of Assembly. What reports have you reviewed of the governor's initiative to investigate those who attacked that building and to bring them to justice? Are you telling me that a governor who commands the Attorney General, who has access to the police and all the law enforcement agencies, could not commission, as the chief security officer, an investigation that will yield some clue or some report, some understanding of the circumstances in which that was burned? He didn't do that, Charles. And not doing that, as far as I am concerned, is clearly, points, unmistakably to his soiled fingers in that, initiative. Well, that's a sidekick.
Right.
The point is that there was no investigation. There was no one ever, charged with that dastardly act of, bombing of that thing. And then he ordered the demolition as though, the bombing was in fact, preordained.
Well, I have to say this. There are innumerable instances, both on the federal and the state level, of commissions of all kinds of...
We're not talking about the federal level, we're talking about
the insecurity.
Don't bring the federal into this conversation.
I'm just saying, well, it is part of, the federal is part of it, because the federal has intervened.
We get to the federal, yes.
But what I'm really interested in here is the fact that as a lawyer yourself, because all these things are peripheral.
They're not.
No.
They're central.
No, hold on. The issue here...
They're central, Charles.
The issue here is the process by which you arrived at the declaration of a state of emergency, the things that led to it, and whether those things are legally justified. As a lawyer yourself, sworn to protect and uphold the rule of law, how can you justify the actions taken not only by the president in imposing a state of emergency on Rivers State and suspending a governor when there is no constitutional provision to do so, but also the National Assembly in using a voice vote to approve it? I'm curious to know, because you are a constitutional lawyer.
Yes, I am.
So I'm curious to know what your reaction is.
And I'll give my reaction, Charles. Now, my reaction flows logically and justifiably from everything I've said so far. And I think that, our viewers and our listeners should bear that in mind. For about 14 months, there was no government in Rivers State.
Yeah, but can you deny the fact that those people who you said were members of the State Assembly had vacated their position? They announced that they were vacating their position. They signed affidavits to the effect that they were vacating their position. On what basis would you say that the governor is to blame for that? I don't understand.
Now, when members of parliament, like the Rivers State House of Assembly, when these are not just your everyday people, they're elected officials who were sponsored by political parties. So when they decide that they want to decamp, it's not as simple as somebody taking a microphone and say, I am leaving my party. There are legally mandated procedures that you must follow to effectively decamp, to legally, recognizably decamp from one party to the other. As I am here now, I'm the national spokesman of APC. If I sit here and I say to you, Charles, as of today, I'm no longer APC spokesman, or I'm no longer a member of APC, that says nothing. This is national television. But I must go back and file a letter to my ward chairman informing him of my intention to decamp from APC, to leave the party, to resign from the party. If I don't do that, I don't care how many times I tell you here today that I'm no longer a member of APC. That is of no effect whatsoever. So, you see, speaking about decamping and decamping legally, decamping effectively are two different things. And I think that the confusion is that people just think that because somebody takes a microphone and says, I'm leaving, just like I told you, if I were to make that announcement today, you would think I've left APC. No, I have not left APC. Because, as far as the procedure is concerned, I have not perfected, I have not instrumented my, announcement of leaving. So in other words, don't forget that when that assembly was demolished, assuming without considering that these assemblymen were in fact intended on leaving, there was no longer a facility by which they could in fact, perfect their intention, assuming that was the case, of their leaving the party. There was no such facility because Governor Fubara had completely obliterated that space where, in fact, that could have been done. You see, Charles, let me tell you, again, you can't go from here to here without, proper, process. Now, back to your question, because I think that all of these preliminaries are important, and this is where a lot of our people are getting it wrong. Why there's a lot of hue and cry over nothing. Now, let me restate that, and by the way, this is not just Felix Morka saying this. The Supreme Court of the Federal Republic said so, that there was no effective government in Rivers State. This president did not intervene.
Yeah, but the
in
Supreme
all of the
Court, I have to
yes.
pick you up there. The
Right.
Supreme Court said that for the allocations of Rivers State to resume, that the governor would have to go and submit his budget to the constituted House of Assembly.
Correct.
He made several attempts to do that, and the Assembly locked him out. That's a known fact. Now, beyond that, what people don't understand at the moment is the fact that the Supreme Court hasn't changed its position. That's the prevailing circumstance in Rivers State. But now we're hearing that the federal government has decided to resume allocations to Rivers State in spite of that prevailing Supreme Court decision that is still there. How do you account for
Charles,
that?
no, you are, you see, again, you're framing these questions without reference to the greed of the facts and the reality.
Well, I'm asking
And
you a
that's-
direct
that's-
question
and I'm gonna
about
answer
the
you.
Supreme Court judgment that is...
First, your question, your point is that this governor, following the verdict of the Supreme Court, attempted to now regularize the state body by presenting to the assembly. And in your words, he was locked out. Charles, the governor locked out these legislatures for 14 months.
No, look,
please,
look.
Charles,
What I am talking about
Charles,
is that you're trying to justify one action
Charles,
by
Charles,
referring to something
Charles,
else.
you will let me answer your question.
Yeah,
please.
but the Supreme
Permit
Court,
me,
it's
my
a
dear brother,
straightforward thing.
My dear brother, permit me to answer your question. And I will answer your question. You can't dictate to me where I begin and where I
understand.
end.
It's just that
You answer
time
my
is
question.
galloping ahead, so I'm
is
rather
galloping, but,
concerned.
that does not mean we should, just gloss over.
We're not glossing
No,
over.
we are. Listen, the beginning of my answer to your question is that the governor locked out these, citizens who were elected and mandated by the people, deprived of, effectively representing their people over 14 months. That's my first point. Secondly, the governor is the governor. The governor does not dictate the schedule of a House of Assembly. Because I'm assuming from your question that you are suggesting that from the date of that Supreme Court judgment, there was some restoration of authority of the House of Assembly that the governor had ignored for a long period of time. And that once that authority was restored, they were supposed to simply just take their schedule of not being recognized by the governor for 14 months, and then now recognized by the governor in 2 days, and they were supposed to vacate everything they have on their schedule to accommodate the governor. That's not how it works. The legislature is a legitimate elected House of Assembly imbued with authority to legislate for the good governance of the
but you
government.
can make the same argument.
The governor cannot just come and say, the governor had to take an accommodation by the legislature of a schedule based on their rules and based on their schedule.
Look, it's not
It wasn't to be
it is
dictated
not
by
a
the governor.
straightforward. It's a very murky thing.
Then
The simple reason being
Yes.
that the members of the State Assembly declared themselves to have defected to another party over a protracted period
Charles,
of time.
in the constitution of
So whether or not you go into the legality of their defection,
Charles,
they
please,
declared
you
themselves
raise an
defected.
issue that is also misleading. Please, misleading a lot of commentaries on this, and I must address it. It's critical. Charles, under the Constitution, that says that when you decamp as a legislator, you lose your seat. If you decamp from the party on which you are elected, you lose your seat. There's a proviso. A proviso is an exceptional clause in a constitution. A proviso is like an exception to the rule. If you qualify under the proviso, then the rule does not apply to you. So the rule says if you decamped for reasons of division or of factionalization in your party on the platform of which you were elected, the Constitution says you are not liable to the general rule of forfeiting your seat. And the question as to whether or not a legislator has forfeited his seat is actually a matter for adjudication. You see, Charles, please, just 1 second.
Okay, very briefly, because we're running out of time. I don't want you to
Charles,
lose.
Listen.
I don't want to lose this.
Thank you. If I say that
momentum,
I'm a legislator and I've decamped, and I say I decamped because of division in my party, a civil dispute has arisen that can only be adjudicated by the courts. It doesn't lie in the governor or anyone else to simply, just by fiat, declare that I've lost my seat. Because that's the Constitution.
Right.
That's right.
That's right. Morka,
yes,
I find
Charles.
it fascinating.
That's right.
That you're sitting here making references to the Nigerian Constitution. I have the Nigerian Constitution right here.
I have it in my head.
I have it physically. I don't have it in my head, but this is the Nigerian Constitution. I would like you either to refer to your head or to refer to the book,
right,
and show me in this Constitution where it says that the president can suspend an elected governor, his deputy, and the State House of Assembly that you're talking about. Can you place your hand on your heart as a lawyer and say with utmost unequivocal conviction that the President and the National Assembly followed the letter of the law in the actions they took on this issue of emergency rule in Rivers State?
Charles, first of all,
it's a straightforward question.
And I'm going to answer you
Yeah.
in a straightforward fashion. Charles, I'm a lawyer. And I think I was well trained. I was trained by the best, quite frankly.
Well, you're certainly very articulate.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
But whether or not you're
But Charles, see, but the question you ask me,
moving and bending things is another story.
All lawyers know that when a dispute arises as to the ramifications of constitutional provisions, the courts ultimately, you must think, even though we're lawyers, we're not in the court, but you must think about what the courts will do. The courts have rules for interpreting the Constitution. Now, the provisions that grant the president this extraordinary powers to declare a state of emergency, in other words, to cause some, massive variation of the norm prescribed by the Constitution, that is an extraordinary power that the president possesses. And the president, not me, not you, is authorized to decide whether or not circumstances warrant the exercise of this, massive authority. In the case of Rivers State, and I hear people compare Rivers with what happened in Borno and in Adamawa and in, I think maybe Yobe. Listen, they are not the same. The language that's in the mouth of every Nigerian is economics. The economics of the Nigerian state. Rivers State is host to a massive system of assets that support Nigeria as a country. When you or anyone decides to threaten Nigeria's very critical asset that support the existence of our country, that is not to be trifled with.
Would you say that Lagos State is also a fundamental part of that, the assets of this country that you would say need to be preserved in the interest of the entire country?
We're not discussing Lagos State.
No, I'm asking, I just asked you.
I will not digress to Lagos.
I'm wondering why a curfew could not have been imposed in Rivers State, and as opposed to a state of emergency,
Charles,
and the suspension.
Let me answer that. And no one has said this, but let me say it. Charles, in Rivers State, as I said, for a long period of time, there was no government. Supreme Court confirmed that. Secondly, this governor, even when there were flares of violence, attacks on these installations, this governor said nothing, did nothing. As the chief secretary of the officer of the state, he abdicated his responsibility to, really be, and lead from the front and say to his people, irrespective of the politics, we must refrain from, attempting to disrupt the, all of these assets.
I think I recall the governor saying on several occasions that there should not be violence.
He told his boys to be on standby, that at the right time, he will, look, the video is, I can play it for you right now. I can give it to you to play. Maybe you haven't seen it.
Look,
I can send it to you.
I can cite innumerable instances where the other party in this crisis, Minister Nyesom Wike, made threats against the Ijaw people.
Minister Nyesom Wike is not the governor of Rivers State.
The president
he's not the governor of Rivers State.
Yeah, but that is part of the crisis. The president didn't take note of that. No. I can tell you that there were skirmishes at the rally that Mr. Wike held in Rivers State. The president did not take cognizance of that.
Those are
How do you match those against the attempts by the governor to reach out to the state assembly, attempts that were rebuffed at every step by the assembly to the point where they locked the governor out of the building?
Can you spend 1 second to just address, for the purpose of this conversation, to address, 14 months of locking out the assembly members? Can you spend that? Why are you so fascinated by a governor who came to the assembly 2 days after the Supreme Court judgment, who was compelled, by the way, to finally even decide that these people exist?
But at least he
after 14 months,
he stuck to the rule of law.
No, he didn't.
And that says something about him, doesn't it?
He destroyed democracy in Rivers. He destroyed governance in Rivers. And right now, whatever is playing out, he is the author and the finisher of what you describe as that state of emergency. He called for this. Governor Fubara should be held solely accountable. He is the governor, not Minister Wike, not people in the legislature. Well, he is the sole author and the finisher of the crisis in the River State of Nigeria.
I think many people would disagree.
That would be a free exercise of their opinion.
But I want to say that as always, it's been a very robust discussion. And I like talking with you because you do make your points, but you don't leap on top of the table or bang your fist on the table, which is brilliant. Felix, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Felix Morka is the National Publicity Secretary of the ruling APC party.
Thank you,
Good to see you again.
Thank you. Good to see you.